Thanks for pressing play. You're listening to the Broady Windsor Group on Real Estate, the podcast for homeowners seeking guidance and support on everything related to owning a home. This includes much more than just buying or selling. We've got you covered for everything from mortgages and financing to home maintenance tips, renovation and design advice, and of course, the latest insights and analysis on what's happening in our local communities.
All right. Welcome to the latest episode of the Broady Windsor Group podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm very excited to have today's guest on. I'd like to introduce you to Mandy Novak-Léonard. She is a trained social worker and president and founder of Les Evaluations, Mandy Novak-Léonard. Mandy, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Can you explain to our audience what it is that you do, a little bit of background about what got you where you are today, and explain to us why you're in such high demand?
Okay, excellent. Really great questions. So I started the wonderful world of social work back in 2001 when I started working in crisis intervention. And, my career evolved as I evolved, and I spent some time over at the local CLSC as well. And I found that the thing I liked the most about my work was doing assessments, was doing evaluations, and really being invited into that space with the client to get to know them and to learn about their life and their adventures and their misadventures. And while I was at CLSC, I started to realize that the public system, is great in many ways, but there are things that it's just not quick enough to get done. And one of them was assessing people, especially seniors, to determine if they were still capable of making decisions. Did they understand the impacts of their decisions? And I saw these long wait lists, and I just saw people who were getting more and more desperate because they really needed these assessments. And so, life evolved, I evolved, and I decided, well, maybe it's time to go out on my own. And since 2016, I've been on my own with Les Evaluations, Mandy Novak-Léonard. So what do I do? So essentially, I do assessments primarily of seniors who are living with advancing dementia. I also will assess seniors who have had a stroke, or anybody who has been in a motor vehicle accident or some type of accident where there has been a traumatic brain injury. So essentially, all the clients I see are people that we are questioning, are they still able to make informed decisions? So why is that important? Well, that's important for many legal reasons, which we'll get into as we chat. And why am I in such demand? Well, it's no secret that the population is aging. We are seeing throngs and throngs of people going into their 70s and their 80s, actually at a number that we've never seen before as we see the baby boomers going up in age. And so there's more and more clients, more and more people living longer who need these types of assessments. Absolutely.
We're seeing it in our business. And one of the trends, I think, to your point, is people are living longer. People are healthier longer. Mm-hmm. People are staying in their homes longer. Yep. 10, 15 years ago, we would see seniors tend to make the downsize move a little earlier in life. Whereas now we're seeing people staying into their homes well into their late 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And we get a lot of calls from families who may be concerned about their aging parents living alone in their homes, if one of them is widowed or even if they're together. So this question of mental capacity, power of attorneys, mandates, we get a lot. Mm-hmm. And so I think we'd like to sort of learn a little bit more about what that all means, what are the legal implications, and what are things that people should be aware of, what are mistakes people should look out and avoid, and steps that people can take to make this process, this transition, much more stress-free for everyone.
Because it can be a lot, it can maybe not be perfectly stress-free, but it can certainly be far less stressful than where people often find themselves. So, we'll take a step back a little bit. Dementia on its own can be tricky because the first couple of stages of dementia doesn't scream dementia. Often it's confusion, it's a little bit of forgetfulness, the person might be repeating the same questions, and most people will kind of attribute it to, oh, it's okay, he's getting a little bit older, or, he's had a big event happen in his life, it's normal, he's more distracted, which could quite possibly be. But then it becomes evident at a certain point that this is in fact a neurocognitive disorder, okay? And it's at that point that it's very important that people, if they still are sound mind, get all their paperwork done. You want to get your power of attorney done. You want to contact your notary and make a mandate in anticipation of an incapacity, or a protection mandate is what we're calling them today. And you want to get that done because you're giving an advance directive to people to say, if the day comes, I can't manage my affairs, I can't administer my property, I can't protect my person, I want this person that I've chosen to do it for me. So whenever I see mandates, I always feel like I'm working with the person. They've told me who they want. And it's very nice to see that because I know I'm doing right by them because they're telling me what they want. And they prepared it at a time that they were capable of doing that. So often when someone first gets diagnosed with dementia, they still are compos mentis, capable, apt is another expression we often hear. And time will progress. And unfortunately, these are illnesses, these are diseases that are progressive in nature and are not reversible at this time. So we know it will just get worse. And the person will reach a point that they are no longer able to make decisions, meaning they don't understand the pros and the cons of the decision that they have to make. They don't understand the implications. They don't understand how it will impact them. And with dementia, there's a phenomenon that we always see. It's called anosognosia. And often it's misunderstood, and people will often misinterpret it as being in denial. Oh, he's in denial. He's in denial that he has dementia. He's in denial that he can't make his breakfast anymore. It's actually not that. It's actually the phenomenon of anosognosia happening, which is a Greek word for the absence of insight. The person's brain legitimately does not allow them to see how the disease is impacting their functioning. So that's why it's so important that the people around them be very mindful of what's happening and what's going on. So when you first asked the question, we had talked about power of attorney and mandates. So I'm a social worker. If you have, in-depth questions about those particular documents, best to speak to a notary. But essentially, a power of attorney is a document that we use when someone is capable and we are representing them for certain acts. So a classic example would be a snowbird who goes down to Florida, calls up their son or daughter and says, hey, check the mail. My tax bill should be coming in. Yep, tax bill's been received. Okay, go to the city and pay it. Okay, so child goes down to the city, pays it, blah, blah. At any time, the city could call up that senior and say, hey, your daughter, your son's here paying your tax bill. And they'll say, yeah, I sent them. Person is perfectly compos mentis, understands what they're doing. They just physically need somebody else to go and do the act for them. Where we start to go towards the mandate of protection or protection mandate is when the person no longer has that reflex, no longer has that understanding. We start to move away from working in concert with them and consulting them and following their instructions to doing for them because they can't anymore. So as a neurocognitive disorder, whether it's Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, as that advances, concepts like bill payment, concepts like time start to become nebulous. They just don't exist anymore. So we can't expect the person to remember, oh, geez, my bill is always due on the 30th. They don't remember the date anymore. The year is confusing for them. How can we expect them to remember the 30th of the month to pay that bill? They often don't remember how to pay the bill, what the impact is if they don't pay the bill. And for smaller things, it's not the end of the world. Someone can often do like catching up. But families will start to do it for them proactively. And at that point, we now start to say, okay, is this person still capable? So when they're no longer capable, as soon as you suspect that someone is not capable of making decisions and that they have assets to administer, you're really no longer in the power of attorney and in the mandate. And the tricky thing about the mandate is that although we have it written on beautiful paper from the notary stamped, it is not valid, it is not legal until the courts give a judgment to activate it.
Absolutely. I think that's a key point, and one that we encounter often is that we'll get a call from children of a senior, often adult children of a senior, who is still living at home. And just to your point, they are actually acting in that mandate of protection. They are paying their bills for them. They are basically helping them manage the day-to-day operations of their property, their home. And, they're able to still live in the home autonomously, but certainly when it comes to decision-making, cognitive function, they're there and they're helping. So I think, and then the point comes where the family decides, and hopefully and often with the agreement of the senior, who may be in the early stages of dementia, that it's time to sell the house. It's getting too much to manage. Sometimes the patient or the senior may resist. I'm sure you see that a lot. They think they're fine. They can still live at home. They can still drive. We're going through that in our own family, so I'm well aware. We've also been through it with my own father, who had Alzheimer's and passed away from the disease a few years ago. So we're these are very challenging times for a family. But I think, to your point of when the court needs to give you the power to exercise that mandate, i.e., the big one, if you want to sell the home, that mandate needs to be homologated. Correct? Can you explain what that process looks like? What is a homologation?
Absolutely.
And again, going from experience, how long it takes to get a mandate homologated? It doesn't take a couple weeks, right?
Correct. Okay, so let's jump into this. So many families are just trying to get through their day-to-day. Caring for somebody with dementia is not an easy task. You're essentially paying their bills, you're making sure the house is well kept, you're making sure they're safe, you're making sure they're fed, you're making sure they're dressed. You're just trying to get through the day-to-day. And then you start hearing about this concept of homologation, activating the mandate, having legal authority to make decisions, and you're thinking, oh, I can't even think about it, right? So often I will get calls from people calling me for a variety of reasons. One of them is exactly what you've just described. Dad fell, he's in the hospital, he can't return home, and he's on the wait list for a public placement, but it'll be another 18 months before he gets in. So we need to go private. And I need to sell the house because, well, I can't insure it fully. I spoke to the insurance company. No one's living there. We can't insure it fully. And I need the money. I need the money. Yeah. I need the money to be able to pay for his care, to bridge this time. And they're scared. They're very nervous. And, so many implications that come in. Another classic example that I'll get is people who want to remain in a home and have home care services come in, but home care services are expensive, and they want to withdraw more money draw down more from the investments of the senior. Yeah. And they call up the investment advisor, and the investment advisor says, I need that permission from your father or your brother. And there's no way, they can't even identify themselves anymore. Yeah. They can't give their date of birth. They can't give their address. And that's when the investment advisor says, I'm sorry, I can't release those funds without a homologated mandate. So when we homologate a mandate, homologation is a fancy Greek word to say, to make official. So this mandate says, if ever the day comes that I'm unable to manage my affairs or protect my person, I want my daughter to take over the decision making. And in that particular case, the daughter becomes the mandatory. Okay? Now, here in Quebec, we have a history of taking away people's rights way too quickly. So this homologation process has been put in with all of its checks and balances to make sure that it's a last recourse. This is really what needs to be done to protect the person from either fraud, could be one, but really to protect them also from the issues that they could have because they can't administer assets or protect their person. So homologation, what is it? What does it mean? It simply means that the courts are going to look at the mandate. The courts are going to look at the assessments that are done by a social worker and by a doctor and conclude that this person is no longer capable of making decisions. So the first step in homologation is to speak with a notary to open up the file, and then to get the doctor's assessment and to get the social worker's assessment, because those two pieces have to be given to the courts to open up a request, a demand, or an application for the homologation of a mandate. And it sounds scary. It sounds like, I'm just trying to get my dad through his days. How the heck am I going to do all of this too? But with the right social worker and the right notary, it's a lot smoother and a lot softer than people realize.
Absolutely. And so this is where your specialty comes in.
Very much.
You do these assessments as a social worker. You have a list of notaries that are experienced in homologations, dealing with these type of mandates of protection. So really, I think the takeaway here is to not wait too long. When the time comes, you've got to go ahead and exercise that right to get the mandate homologated. As you said, the homologation is a protection for patients
100%.
Against somebody deeming them incapacitated and administering their affairs when actually they shouldn't be. So I think that's a good protection. And okay, so let's change gears a little bit. We talked about what a homologation is. I think you explained that beautifully. What is something that people should be looking out for in terms of the qualities of the professionals that they're seeking to help with this kind of process?
That's an excellent question. So you're going to have three main professionals involved in homologation. You're going to have a notary who's involved, you're going to have a medical doctor involved, and you're going to have a social worker involved. Make sure that the notary you're dealing with actually does homologations, because not all notaries do it. It's an extra training. It's an extra certificate after they've graduated. So you want to check with the notary. Do you do them? Yes. How quickly can you get to my file? So there are some that make it a priority and others make it less of a priority. So make sure it's a priority. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the doctor. All medical doctors in Quebec are qualified to complete the medical assessment. Are they all comfortable? No, they're not all comfortable to do it. So they may refer you to a neurologist, they may refer you to a geriatrician if you don't already have one to complete that assessment. Some doctors will complete it, some GPs will complete it, but specifically will ask to speak to the social worker before they give it in. And that's fine. And then you want a social worker. First of all, you want a social worker who knows the process and knows it well, knows what the courts are looking for in the assessments, because the last thing you want is somebody who doesn't know, turns in the file, and then the court sends it back because some questions are not answered. You need to answer the court's questions before they become a question if you don't want delays. You also need a social worker who understands that this is a very difficult process for families. What we're essentially saying is that this person is no longer capable. They have reached a point in their disease that we have to take away their right to make decisions. And this is very painful for families. It's very confronting because they realize that they have reached a point of no return, that their loved one is at that point, and it's very difficult. And they feel very powerless. They feel very sad. And you have to know that as a social worker, you're not just there filling in those papers. You're there listening to that story and listening to that narrative.
And sometimes some feelings of guilt, right? Like I'm taking a dad's driver's license away and I'm taking control of selling dad's house that he's been in for 30, 40 years. Like there's a lot of guilt there, especially if dad is not in agreement.
No,
right?
There's a lot of guilt there. Yes, there's often a lot of guilt. There's a lot of sadness. There's a lot of powerlessness, but guilt, that's a big one. Guilt is a very big one.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes be why people wait a long time to get it done.
Yeah.
Because they know in the back of their mind they need to get it done, but that guilt and that heaviness stays with them. So I'm very aware of that when I'm working with clients, and I make sure to help shoulder that with them.
Okay.
And move them through the process as smoothly as possible, and talk about those feelings if we have to. Bring them up. It's okay. It's the space for it.
Another question I have for you, Mandy, is what are some of the most common challenges that you see in a family dynamic? I know you talked about feelings of sadness, of guilt. From more of a logistical standpoint, is there anything that in your experience, maybe you can share a story or an anecdote from your career that can really help people sort of get through this transition and make the process a little bit less stressful for everyone involved?
So one thing that does tend to come up during this time when I'm doing the assessment, stuff from the past often will come up. Okay, you can't have a wedding without the past coming up. You can't have a funeral without the past coming up. Well, you can't have homologation without the past coming up. And sometimes things that were never resolved in the past tend to come back up, right, as we're doing this process. And it's really, really important for me as a professional to be able to hear that, to be able to put it into context, to be able to validate what the person's feeling, but also be able to gently put it back to them if it's not appropriate for that particular space. There's often a lot of feelings that are being carried. And when we're living with somebody or we're caring for somebody with a neurocognitive disorder, burnout is quite high as well. People get burnt out emotionally, physically, psychologically. And there's actually a phenomenon called caregiver burnout. So a caregiver burnout and caregiver dementia, where they become more forgetful because they've got so much on their mind. I always encourage the family members to seek support, whether it's through the Alzheimer's Society or Alzheimer's Group Incorporated. It's so important that they have a place, a unique place where they can share their feelings and realize it's not them that's just feeling this, it's all caregivers feeling this. Because there's a big charge that goes there. And people will often, report to me, "Oh, Mandy, I don't have time to sit in a room and talk to people for an hour." Mm-hmm. And yet they do it a few times and they walk away and they feel so much lighter. They feel like they can get through their days better. They can get through their weeks a little easier. So as much as I'm there to do an assessment, I'm also there to help them navigate the system, and I'm there to help them navigate themselves. Because when we have a caregiver who is cared for, they're able to care for their loved one even better.
That's amazing. That's so well put. I remember when we had, my father was suffering from Alzheimer's, and he was home with my mom for the better part of 10 years. She was his primary caregiver. And you're absolutely right. Caregiver burnout is real. And people, I don't think, it was an eye-opening experience for us to see how difficult and how much work it is to care for someone who's slowly deteriorating cognitively. Yeah. When you've got them at home and seeing the care and the difficult job that caregivers have in retirement homes too.
Yes.
As we placed my dad, finally convinced my mom that it was time to place him. It was just too much for her to handle. Yeah. And the caregivers where he was were phenomenal. Yeah. So I take my hat off to them, all you caregivers out there.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a tough job.
It's a tough job, and it's an endless job.
Yeah. Yeah.
So caring for somebody with a neurocognitive disorder, we forget that there's no weekends for them. Yeah. There's no evenings off.
That's right.
They're always caregiving. And often people think that a cognitive decline will be this kind of smooth kind of decline, this straight line. But actually, the way I've seen people live it is more like a staircase. So they'll plateau for a little while, and then there'll be a dramatic drop in their functioning. And for the caregiver who has adapted to this new level of functioning, all of a sudden, within weeks, months, boom, there's a sharp decline. And they've got to revisit all of the techniques and everything that they have in place to adapt to this new level of functioning.
Yeah.
And that's psychologically exhausting.
So, big takeaway. There is support out there.
Oh.
There's help out there.
Yes.
Don't try and do it all on your own. And to be the best version of yourself as a caregiver, you need support. You need help.
100%. Yeah.
Can you walk me through what it looks like when you first get a call from a family? Do you go over and sit with all the parties? Like, do you sit with the whole family? Or do you just meet with the kids first? Do you meet with the patient first? What does that look like?
Okay, so what does that look like? So generally I get phone calls from the kids.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about it, and I'll speak with them for a few minutes to see, are we there yet?
Right.
Are we there yet? And there's a few key things that I start to look for. So not every file will have this, but most files where we're at the point of the person not being capable is that the concerned party is asking to go home. They don't recognize that they are home. Especially in the evening, they'll say, I want to go home. They don't recognize that they're home. They don't recognize their spouse as being their spouse. Or they're asking for deceased parents. So when I start hearing that they're asking these types of questions, I want to go visit my mother, forgetting she's been dead for 40 years.
Yeah.
I know generally we're at that point. And so what I often do is I meet with the mandatory first. So the person who's named in the mandate to take over decision making.
Okay.
And I like to sit down with them, no pressure with anybody else around. I mean, if they want somebody else around, absolutely fine. I'm totally open and transparent to my work. And I like to sit down and talk with them about their concerns, about the history of the person. Some people think that these assessments are just to prove that there's a diagnosis and an incapacity. My assessments reflect the person's life. They reflect their adventures, their misadventures, everything in between. Because at the end of the day, a person is not a diagnosis. They're a person. And I want that to come through in the assessment. I want to write in the assessment, he loved to go boating on the weekends when the sun was shining, because that's who they are. That's still part of them. It's just that the disease is taking that away. So I sit with them for a good hour and a half. We go through those pieces. And then I will go and meet with the concerned party. And I always invite, if a family member wants to be there, be there. It's okay. Because I want the person to be comfortable. And if they're more comfortable with their loved one there, that's what we do. And I always go to the client. I never ask them to come to me, because it's scary for somebody with dementia to have to go to a place they don't know. They don't know what's expected of them. But in their home, if they want to be in their pajamas, sitting on their couch, I have no qualms about it. And the assessment itself, people are often concerned that the assessment is like an interrogation. And I'm not like that. It's a conversation. We talk. If the person can't answer question, we move on to the next one. If they tell me it's 1962 the year, in my head I guess 1962 was a good year for the person. And we keep going. I don't correct them. I don't make them feel bad. It's not their fault that they have dementia. So I'm not going to make them feel bad. And then we go through it. And I wrap it up, and I thank the person for their time. And then I consult with the other people in the family. So the courts will reject a file if the spouse and all the children are not spoken to. So even if a child is in Australia, in BC, it doesn't matter. I have to speak to all of them, and I have to get all of their feedback for the tribunal.
Can you speak to where you might come in and advise somebody if they're just wanting some information? Maybe mom or dad, or both of them are starting to slow down a bit, but they're not sure what stage they're at. Can you speak to what you would advise people in that instance?
Okay, that's an excellent question, because like it or not, as we age, there's atrophy to the brain that's happening. We can't avoid it. It's part of life. And some forgetfulness is just forgetfulness.
It's just normal.
It's just normal. So sometimes when people are concerned and they'll say, Mandy, I'm really not sure if I'm there yet, I offer to do a partial assessment. I'll say, how about I sit with them? I'll do the assessment, and then I'll write it all up, and we'll look at it together. And families really like that, because at the end they'll make the conclusion saying, yes, there are deficits, but we're not at homologation yet. There's still a lot of space before that, because we always want to protect the autonomy of the person as well. And then it's not unusual for me to get a call 2-3 years later from that same family saying, remember, Mandy, you assessed my parents? Yep. Well, back then they could do A, B, and C. Lately, we're noticing they're not able to do that. Can you come back? And most of the time when I go back and I revisit them, we're at that point. We're at the point that they need a substitute decision maker. They need the mandate to be activated by the courts.
I think that's great, because then you've educated the family on the process. They've been through it. They then know the importance of getting the homologation done.
Exactly.
And you can get the ball rolling.
Exactly.
How long does it typically take to get homologation?
So there's a few variables to that. The two biggest variables being whether your doctor is available to fill in the medical in a fairly quick manner.
Okay.
In the old system, doctors were very proactive, and they would say to the families, you're at the point of needing to homologate the mandate, and they'd fill in the medical and they'd give it to the families, and then the families would go see the notaries and start the process. So we weren't necessarily hitting the proverbial wall. Now we have a system that's much more reactive. So they're chasing the doctor to get the assessment, and it's often because we've hit the wall, right? So let's pretend your doctor's available to you. You can have that assessment in about 2 weeks. Okay. My work takes about 2.5 weeks, depending on the number of kids that need to be interviewed and the availability of those parties. And then it's given to the notary. And if your notary's giving it a good top priority, there's no reason within a month of giving all the paperwork to that notary, it can't be deposited to the courts. Now, it's the courts is the biggest variable. Yeah. So when we give it into the courts, it's stamped. So if anybody ever asks, like, are you homologating the mandate? You can say yes, and here's the number that the courts have attributed to it. I'm waiting for my judgment. Many people get scared that when we deposit it to the courts, it means that their loved one will have to go to court. They seem to think that their loved one will have to stand in front of a judge, and not the case. Not the case. No. Instead, a special clerk is assigned to the file who will do the interviews for the person. It's really the special clerk. Their time, how long it takes, is really a variable on them. I've seen some that come through after 3 months. I've seen some we've waited 5 months. Yeah.
So the whole process can be 5-6 months and up to a year.
5-6 months and up to a year, especially if the special clerk looks at one of the assessments and says, I have questions, and sends it back to the notary. Yeah. Then there's a delay.
Okay, yeah. That's what we've been seeing too with our situation with my wife's father and with clients. 6 months to a year seems to be it. So cautionary bit of advice there for people that are thinking they want to put the house on the market. We've had that before. We've had people call us and say, we want to list mom's house. And my question to them is, well, what's mom's sort of cognitive function like? Well, she has good days and bad days. You hear that one a lot. And that's always, for me, a bit of a red flag. Yeah. Because if we get to a point where we list the house, we sell the house, we end up going to the notary to transact the sale, and mom has to come in and sign the deed of sale, and it's a bad day, and that mandate should have been activated and that homologation should have been done, guess what? Notary is not allowed to process the sale. You're back to square one.
Correct. And I have had phone calls of people crying, saying, we just left the notary's office. The notary doesn't think mom is capable, doesn't understand the transaction that's happening. And it's within the notary's right to stop the transaction.
That's right.
They're a neutral party. And crying, saying, I have to homologate this mandate. I didn't know. And I'm going to lose my buyers because by the time it's done, I've lost my buyer. And I'm freaking out. It's essentially what I'm told.
Huge deal. Huge mistake.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we see it more often than not.
Yeah.
Yeah, just try and avoid the homologation.
Yeah, exactly. People try and skate on the line, and I know they're busy, and I know they've got this charge, but it's so much worse when they find themselves in that situation because it takes a village to make this, to work it through. Yeah. And in those files, I mean, I always leave room for my emergency files. It happens, I'm going to say, every second week I get these calls.
I bet.
Yeah,
gotta get this done right away.
I wish I would have known in advance. I would have done it. I didn't realize, and... It's painful to find yourself in that spot.
Hopefully, many of you in the West Island and the greater Montreal area get to listen to or see this podcast on YouTube. Check Spotify, Apple, all the platforms where the podcast is. Yeah. You'll get to hear the amazing advice from Mandy Novak-Léonard. And I think that was super informative. Anything else you want to add before we sign off?
If clients have any questions, give me a call, send me an email. I'm happy.
Where's the best place to reach you?
So you can reach me at Mandy Novak-Léonard, all in one word, no spaces, at outlook.com, and Novak is Novak.
Okay, super. And Mandy, Mandy.
You've got it.
No E.
You've got it. No E. No E.
We're going to put all of your contact information in the notes. So there you go. If you need help, Mandy's the one to speak to. She's been helping families for many, many years, and fantastic West Island resident and friend of mine.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, my pleasure.